gone.
I'll use it, professora.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for your patience. We had a small technical issue, but we are ready to go. NEI Digital Lectures aims to discuss aspects of the annual themes conducted and explored by Núcleo de Estudos Irlandeses at UFSC every year. This year is dedicated to the theme Places, Spaces, and Psychogeographies of Ireland. We have the honor to welcome Professor Sean Richards for this inaugural lecture, and he will talk to us about stage sets and theatrical nationhood in the Irish literary revival. Sean Richards is Emeritus Professor of Irish Studies at Stafford University in the UK. He is a founding member of the British Association of Irish Studies and a long-term member of the executive of the International Association for the Study of Irish Literatures. He has published articles and chapters in major journals and edited collections, including Modern Drama, Irish University Review, Irish Studies, the Oxford Handbook of Modern Irish Theatre, the Palgrave Handbook of Contemporary Irish Theatre and Performance, and Irish Literature in Translation. Other significant publications include 50 key Irish plays, contemporary Irish documentary theatre, which I have the honor to be a co-editor with him, Mapping Irish Theatre with Chris Morash, where is it here? The Cambridge Companion to 20th Irish Drama. So, Sean, you can see you feature heavily in my bookshelves. And of course, the seminal Writing Ireland with David Cairns in 1988. Sean is one of the most respected scholars in the field of Irish theatre, and he has been to Brazil more than once to teach, to lecture, and as an advisor to C. Ludin's theatre company. So welcome back to Brazil, Sean, even if online. I would like to thank the continued support of DFA's Immigrant Support Program via the Consulate General of Ireland in São Paulo, the postgraduate program in English at UFSC for hosting this lecture, Dr. Aline Fernandes, Chair of NEI, and the interns Yasmin Rezende and Carol Oliveira, who are running this event. Sean, the floor is yours now. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Beatrice. Given the weather here, I'd rather be with you in Brazil, but there you go. Well, the title, as you know, Stage Sets and Theatrical Nationhood in the Irish Literary Revival. Just to explain briefly before I really start what's going on in the title. Well, stage sets, I'm talking about the form of stage set that really developed in Europe in the last part of the 19th century, particularly associated in France with André Antoine, whose search for realism made him put actual bloody sides of beef on stage in a play about butchers, simply to get that extra realism and convince the audience they were seeing something taken from real life. Theatrical nationhood, I'll define in a moment. Irish literary revival, difficult to be precise about the years there, but we're really talking about the period from the 1890s, when we see the start of the push to develop and enhance Irish literature, culture, and language, and the 1920s, when the Free State, of course, is established. Anyway, I want to start with a section from The Dead, if we can have the first slide. It's from The Dead, the final story in James Joyce's collection, Dubliners. And it's set, you might remember, at a Christmas party in 1904. And it opens with a conversation between the male protagonist, Gabriel Conroy, and a young woman, Miss Ivers, with whom he's about to dance. And Miss Ivers speaks first. Well, Mr. Conroy, will you come for an excursion to the Aran Isles this summer? We're going to stay there a whole month. It'll be splendid out in the Atlantic. You ought to come. Mr. Clancy's coming, and Mr. Kilkelly, and Kathleen Carney. It'd be splendid for Greta, too, if she'd come. She's from Connaught, isn't she? Greta being Gabriel's wife. Her people are, said Gabriel shortly. But you will come, won't you, said Miss Ivors, laying her warm hand eagerly on his arm. The fact is, said Gabriel, I've just arranged to go. Go where? Asked Miss Ivors. Well, you know, every year I go for a cycling tour with some fellows. But where? Asked Miss Ivors. Well, we usually go to France or Belgium or perhaps Germany, said Gabriel awkwardly. And why do you go to France and Belgium, said Miss Ivors, instead of visiting your own land? Well, said Gabriel, it's partly to keep in touch with the languages and partly for a change. And haven't you your own language to keep in touch with? Irish? Asked Miss Ivors. Well, said Gabriel, if it comes to that, you know, Irish is not my language. Their neighbours had turned to listen to the cross-examination. Gabriel glanced right and left nervously and tried to keep his good humour under the ordeal, which was making his blush invade his forehead. And haven't you your own land to visit, continued Miss Ivors, that you know nothing of, your own people in your own country? Oh, to tell you the truth, retorted Gabriel suddenly, I'm sick of my own country, sick of it. Why? Asked Miss Ivors. Gabriel did not answer. His retort had heated him. Why? Repeated Miss Ivors. As he'd not answered her, Miss Ivors said warmly, Of course, you've no answer. Gabriel tried to cover his agitation by taking part in the dance with great energy. He avoided her eyes, for he'd seen a sour expression on her face. But when they met in the long chain, he was surprised to feel his hand firmly pressed. She looked at him from under her brows for a moment, quizzically, until he smiled. Then, just as the chain was about to start again, she stood on tiptoe and whispered in his ear, West Britain. Okay. Now that dispute between Miss Ivors and Gabriel, which takes place in Dublin, is clearly spatial as well as cultural political. She references the West and the Aran Islands. He references Europe, and even worse, England, as indicated by her insult, West Britain. And as is clear from Miss Ivors' repetition of your own, she says your own land, your own language, your own people, your own country. She sees Gabriel's choice of Europe as a betrayal of his Irishness. Now, the short story from which I've just read was set in 1904, but written at the time of the Playboy riots in 1907, years we'll return to. But the basis of that dispute goes back to the early years of the 19th century and continued well into the 20th. If you could have the next slide, please. In the 1840s, Thomas Davis, one of the leaders of the Young Ireland nationalist movement, condemned what he termed, and I quote, this thing, call it Yankeeism or Englishism, which measures prosperity by exchange value, measures duty by gain, and limits desires to clothes, food, and respectability. This damn thing has come into Ireland and threatens to corrupt the lower classes, who are still faithful and romantic. To use every literary and political engine against this seems to me the first duty of an Irish patriot. Next slide, please. If we fast forward to the early 1900s, we find the author, the critic, the playwright George Moore being interviewed about his reason for leaving London. He references Brixton, which was part of East London, which underwent rapid expansion in the 19th century. And the WA who's talking to Moore is William Archer, who was the English translator of Henrik Ibsen. And W. Archer says, I want to hear more of your reasons for shaking the dust of London off your feet. I must escape from the Brixton Empire. British Empire, you mean? I call it the Brixton Empire. This empire of vulgarity and greed and materialism and hypocrisy that's crawling around the whole world, throttling other races and nationalities, all for their own good, of course, and reducing everything to one machine-made Brixton pattern. So you expect to find in Ireland a green oasis in a wilderness of khaki? Yes. Well, if we pick out a few elements from those two pieces, from Davis and from Moore, we find a clear similarity, albeit the best part of a century apart. England is seen as grubby and materialistic. Ireland is green. It's peaceful, faithful, and romantic. And it's that binary, that spatial binary, which we see in the writings, for example, of J.M. Synge. He lamented the fact that Ireland was becoming Anglicised and dreaded the moment when even the Aran Islands would fall. Synge, of course, along with W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory, was one of the directors of the Abbey Theatre, founded in 1904. And in the letter written in 1897 to attract sponsors for the idea of a national theatre, Gregory wrote of the reasons for staging Irish plays. We hope to find in Ireland an uncorrupted and imaginative audience, and believe that our desire to bring upon the stage the deeper thoughts and emotions of Ireland will show that Ireland is not the home of buffoonery and of easy sentiment as it's been represented, but the home of an ancient idealism. We are confident of the support of all Irish people who are weary of misrepresentation. Again, then, as in the pieces from Moore and Thomas Davis, we get the idea that the Irish are uncorrupted, the implication not affected by materialism, but also the idea that they've been misrepresented. And so the stage will be mobilized to show the reality. Now, this letter and the establishment of the Abbey is often taken as the start of using the stage to effect a resistance to the Anglicising of Ireland. But like the debate, the use of the stage to present an Irish reality, albeit an idealised one, predates Lady Gregory's letter by some 20 or more years. The next slide. This is from the autobiography of John Denver, The Life Story of an Old Rebel, written in 1910, which in fact is available online on Gutenberg. And in his memoir, Denver recalls how he and a group of Liverpool Irish, who operated under the name of the Emerald Minstrels, travelled to Dublin on a number of occasions in the 1860s and 1870s and put on a show called Terence's Fireside. I say show rather than play because, as their name perhaps suggests, the Emerald Minstrels were modelled on minstrel shows, the form imported from America, in which white performers would perform songs, dances, comic routines in blackface, as if in a plantation in the southern states. And for the southern states, the Emerald Minstrels substituted Ireland. So this is what Denver has to say about their stage. First, he says they had a drop scene. In other words, that's a curtain. We had a drop scene representing the lower lake of Killarney. When it was raised, it disclosed the interior of a living room of a comfortable Irish homestead, with a large projecting open chimney, the turf fire on the hearth, and the usual pious and patriotic pictures proper to such an interior. Terence's Fireside. The first part of the entertainment, showing old Terence in the chimney corner and the others singing songs, telling stories, almost necessitated our sitting around in a semicircular formation. To depart from this somewhat, we occasionally introduced a trifling plot. We made it that one of the sons of the house entered while the family were engaged in the usual avocations, having unexpectedly returned from America. Then came the affectionate family greeting, the bringing in of friends and neighbours, who formed a group sitting around the turf fire, making a merry night of it. Have the next slide, please. Denver is very clear as to what the objectives of the Emerald Minstrels were: the cultivation of Irish music, poetry, and the drama, Irish literature generally, Irish pastimes and customs, and above all, Irish nationality. And well before the efforts of Yeats, Lady Gregory and Synge, and the establishment of the Abbey Theatre, Denver says, "We considered we were doing good work by elevating the tastes of our people, who had tolerated an objectionable class of so-called Irish songs, as well as the more objectionable stage Irishmen." In other words, before Gregory, Denver was rejecting the ideas of buffoonery and wanted to use the stage set to represent a real Ireland. That, I said, was a show, probably the first fully fledged play, according to these principles, appeared in 1901. If we could have the next slide. This was Douglas Hyde's play, Casa and Sugan, The Twisting of the Rope. It's set, very simply, we're told, a farmer's house in Munster 100 years ago. But what I want to talk about is the audience reaction. Now, the play was written and performed in Irish. Hyde himself played the main character. And the theatre was full of enthusiastic members of the Gaelic League. That's the organization founded by Hyde himself in 1893 to foster the Irish language. And records tell us that these Gaelic Leaguers made shouts out loud throughout the performance in Irish. According to the politician and literary man Stephen Gwynn, "I heard from behind me shouts of encouragement to the performers in the dance. There was a magnetism in the air. In the entr'actes, a man up in the gallery with a fine voice sang song after song in Irish, the gallery joining in with the chorus and an attentive house applauding. There was magnetism in the air." And J.M. Synge recorded, "The auditorium shuddered with emotion. Many people broke into tears, and the evening continued in an atmosphere of vibrant emotion." And then he says, "The soul of a nation had entered the theatre." This, in the words of Loren Kruger, was an example of theatrical nationhood, the idea of representing the nation in the theatre, summoning a representative audience that in turn recognizes itself as a nation on stage. In other words, it's just kind of reinforcement of the feeling that the audience already has, a reinforcement, a confirmation. And if we go to the next slide, but this is a theatre in which only validated images are deemed to be true. True here has been used in the sense defined by Michel Foucault. Foucault wrote, "Each society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth. That is, the type of discourses it accepts and makes function as true." And these true, I'm putting inverted commas around true all the time here, these true performances are those defined by the Italian critic Marco Marinis as closed performances, which anticipate a very precise receiver and demand well-defined types of competence for their correct reception. In other words, if you weren't from that specifically Irish culture and you went in to see these plays, you simply wouldn't see what was true. You would not be in that loop. What was clear from the next quotation from the nationalist leader Arthur Grifith is what the nationalists wanted theatre to do. "We look to the Irish National Theatre primarily as a means of regenerating the country. The theatre is a powerful agent in the building up of a nation. When it's in foreign and hostile hands, it's a deadly danger to the country. When it's controlled by native and friendly hands, it's a bulwark and a protection." The next slide, please. Here, the French theorist Anne Ubersfeld helps us understand what's going on. Ubersfeld wrote, "What is given in the theatrical space is never an image of the world, but the image of an image. That which is imitated is not the world, but the world recast according to the fiction and in the frame of a culture and a code. And one is prepared to define the truth of a stage image, he says, or if one prefers, its realism by its conformity not to an ungraspable reality, but to this imaginary space. When she uses imaginary there, she's using what's often referred to as the social imaginary, namely the set of beliefs which structure the understanding of a world for a society or for a group within society. Now, three important things about the theatre groups which finally coalesced as the Irish National Theatre. They were poor, they were amateur, and they were nomadic. Nomadic in the sense they didn't have their own theatre. They played in a succession of small halls around Dublin. As you perhaps know, the original Abbey Theatre was partly destroyed by fire in 1951. It was then rebuilt on the same site and opened in 1965. But the size of the present Abbey stage is much, much larger than the original. So if one was to go to the Abbey today and see a play by, for example, J.M. Synge, it would occupy a much larger space than that for which it was originally written. The original Abbey stage was only 6.3 meters wide, just over 4 meters high, and only 4.5 meters deep. Very small, but perfectly suited to match the exact dimensions of an Irish cottage as one would find in the West. Now, as I've said, these groups were poor, and given the economic and spatial concerns, the same sets were used many times. And across the opening decade of the 20th century, there was twice as many of these peasant cottage plays produced as any other type of drama. And the directors and playwrights of the Abbey sought accuracy in the most direct of ways. They'd actually go out and take sketches of cottages and then use those as the reference points for the stage sets they designed. And we can see this in the stage directions for J.M. Synge's Shadow of the Glen, which he wrote while staying in a cottage in Wicklow. Cottage kitchen, turf fire on the right, bed near it against the wall, a door at the other end of the room with a low table near it, and stools or wooden chairs. A couple of glasses on the table, and a bottle of whiskey as if for a wake, with 2 cups, a teapot, a homemade cake. And when Synge saw the set that Willie Fay, one of the directors of the theatre, had designed, he said, "It was just what I saw while writing the play." And Synge also demanded that authentic clothing, footwear, and artifacts were supplied for his plays. In short, the plays were exact models, as far as they could make it, of peasant cottages. Next sign, please. Frank Fay, in fact, noted, most of the plays in the company's repertoire are peasant plays. That is, plays dealing with peasant life. They're dressed exactly as in real life. The dress has been made specifically by the tailors employed by the peasantry, and the properties are absolutely correct. And along with the recreation of virtual reality went that of movement. For as a program for the Abbey from 1906 declared, the players of the company are all familiar with the ways of the Irish peasantry, and in their acting, care is taken to keep close to the actual movements and gestures of the people. You can see that the intention to produce a completely accurate on-stage rendition of a real cottage was absolute. Here, I want to come to a kind of problem, if you like. If the stage sets were so accurate, and they clearly were, why did some plays produce such negative, even violent reactions from audience? Well, the reality of the Irish revival is that it was made up of competing groups. The Anglo-Irish of Synge, Yeats, Lady Gregory, and what we might term the Irish, such as those Patrick Pearse, who was to lead the Easter Rising of 1916, and whose objective was political independence from Britain. Now, the idealization of the West was a common factor across these groups, but there was also a crucial point of difference. The Anglo-Irish looked to the West as an island which was, in J.M. Synge's terms, fiery, magnificent, tender. In other words, the opposite of middle-class conformity. The Irish, middle-class, largely Catholic nationalists shared the view that the West was rural and uncontaminated by materialism, but also saw it as moral, a prerequisite of rejecting negative English images of the Irish as drunken and feckless. Hence, any suggestion of impropriety in drama was to be condemned. Only if that West of Ireland, one of peasant purity, was staged, was it regarded as true. Now I want to return to Synge's Shadow of the Glen, whose detailed set I've already described. Now in the play, a young woman, Nora Burke, is married to an old man and feels that the vitality of life is being lost. At the end, she goes off for life with a tramp, which, while poor, will have more passion. And here we see how Arthur Griffith responded, the nationalist leader Arthur Griffith. Mr. Synge, or else his play has no meaning, places Nora Burke before us as a type, a personification of an average, and Nora Burke is a lie. It's not by staging a lie that we can serve Ireland. Griffith is probably the author of a little play called In a Real Wicklow Glen, which reverses the outcome of Synge's play in that the female protagonist resists the temptation of a young suitor and stays with the elderly husband. That, of course, is what nationalists would argue happened in a real Wicklow Glen. For, if we look at the next quotation here, men and women in Ireland marry lacking love, live mostly in a dull level of amity. Sometimes they do not. Sometimes the woman lives in bitterness. Sometimes she dies of a broken heart, but she does not go away with the tramp. Here you might say it was the right set, but for a nationalist audience, the content of the drama renders it unreal, renders it a lie. This is nowhere more clearly illustrated than in reactions to Synge's later play, Playboy of the Western World, in 1907. Now, a few crucial things about this production. It was staged in a double bill with Synge's earlier play from 1904, Riders to the Sea, which is set in a cottage on the Aran Islands. Characters in Riders to the Sea face bravely, even heroically, their fate. The audience response on that night to Riders to the Sea was positive. Playboy was then staged after an interval, and audiences were very responsive and attentive throughout the first act. Indeed, Lady Gregory sent a telegram to W.B. Yeats, who was away in Scotland, saying, "Play a great success." But as Act 2 went on, there were murmurs of disapproval. And Loren Kruger, who was in the audience, recorded, "Before the curtain fell, it was obvious there was going to be some sort of trouble. Faint calls and ejaculations like, 'Oh no, take it off,' came from various parts of the house, and the atmosphere grew tense. With Act 3, Lady Gregory had to send a second telegram to Yeats. Play broke up in disorder." Now, it's often said that it was the reference to shift a woman's underclothes that cause these violent reactions. But the fact is that the same set was used for Playboy as for the earlier Riders to the Sea. In other words, audiences initially responded or assumed that Playboy, which was a new play, was of the same accepted order as Riders to the Sea, because of assumptions about what should happen in that stage world and what had just happened in that stage world. But Playboy is a reversal of Riders to the Sea. The cottage kitchen set is now also a shebeen, a pub, and some of the peasants are drunk. And the heroism of the islanders is now the heroism of a man who's killed his father. Playboy is also the reversal of the plot of Hyde's earlier play, The Twisting of the Rope. In The Twisting of the Rope, the villagers combine to exclude a disruptive stranger, and the play ends on an appropriate marriage. Playboy ends with the triumphant exit of the outsider and the disruption of an intended marriage. Given this, and despite the recognition of the set, when the audience realized that this was not part of their imaginary, they reacted. For the play's comic celebration of savagery constituted the most fundamental challenge to what audiences, nationalist audiences, deemed an acceptable representation of Ireland. W.B. Yeats condemned the people who protested, saying they were people who had no books in their houses. But this reaction was not typical. Look at the one from the critic of the Freeman's Journal. Playboy, he said, was an unmitigated, protracted libel upon Irish peasant man, and worse still, upon Irish peasant girlhood. The blood boils with indignation as one recalls the incidents, expressions, ideas of this squalid, offensive production, incongruously styled a comedy in 3 acts. No adequate idea can be given of the barbarous jargon, the elaborate and incessant cursings of these repulsive creatures. In the next slide, we see Arthur Grifith again. For Arthur Grifith, the Playboy was a vile and inhuman story told in the foulest language you've ever listened to from a public platform. The production of a moral degenerate, that's James Synge, a moral degenerate who's dishonored the women of Ireland before all Europe. And the final quotation. For the Dublin critic of the Dublin Evening Mail, it's absurd and un-Irish and smacks of the decadent ideas of the literary flaneurs of Paris rather than of simple Connaught. Here we see again starkly the spatial divide which characterized the cultural, political divisions in the period of the Irish literary revival. The play has been condemned as a product of decadent Paris rather than pure and simple Ireland. Playboy, in other words, was seen to belong to the European world of Gabriel Conroy, not the authentic, pure Ireland of Miss Ivors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. Fascinating to see your reading of the revival of the nation and the stage sets of that time and the reactions of audiences, critics, and the playwrights and leaders of the Irish revival themselves. We have, let me check here. We're open to questions from the floor, if anybody has any. But I would, as people are thinking of their questions, I would like to begin talking to you myself. When you think of the revival, this imagined, this received realism, and what the audiences expected and what they saw and how they reacted. I was thinking that the drama of the revival has outlived the revival, almost like forever up to now. Revival plays are still represented, appreciated. And so what happens to this relation between performing and performers and audience, or drama and audiences now? How come it's still appreciated and performed all the time?
One argument would be there's a big commercial imperative. I'm serious.
Right.
You know, tourism is a massive part of Ireland's appeal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if the Abbey, particularly the Abbey, weren't to be reviving these plays, then there would be a commercial impact for them. That's not to say they're not great plays,
Mm-hmm.
and not to say that other plays aren't performed, but it is very much, if you go there in the kind of tourist period,
Mm-hmm.
they're not all Irish people in those audiences. I think that's what one driver behind. And what was very striking, I think, was that when the Druid Theatre Company back in the early 1980s decided that they were going to produce Playboy of the Western World, they produced it in a style, a kind of dirty realism,
Mm-hmm.
quite unlike the sanitized version that had started appearing on Irish stages basically since the early 1900s. So there are ways of producing it, some that simply pay lip service to what was, and others, and I think the Druid are a good example of that try to interrogate what was and ask, what does it now say? There are two different sides to that particular coin, if that makes sense. And of course, as you know, in the case of someone like Martin McDonagh, you have the same set, but it's parodied. So there are always ways in which it can be used. Sometimes it's simply to celebrate it, sometimes it's to interrogate it, and sometimes, as I think in McDonagh, it's to kind of laugh at it.
Yeah, I asked this exactly because of this, because as you know, very recently, we had this physical disability in Irish theatre cycle of readings. And we started with Synge and ended with Rosalind Madonna. And in between, we had Martin Madonna, the cripple of Englishman. And interestingly enough, the reception for The Well of the Saints, for those who don't know, it's Synge's play with the couple that is blind, was very poor. Almost everybody in the question and answer, and there were lots of theater students were like, this play is dated. And Martin Madonna's play, as aggressive and cruel as it is, was very well received. Everybody was like, oh, why don't you produce it? And so on and so forth. So, yeah, I think in a way, although I love the revival, it has become more difficult to stage these plays and to sell them as good plays. But I'm not sure.
Just one point about the cripple of Inishmaan. In the stage set, which there's part of it is in a shop, right. And McDonagh says, "What's on the shelves?" And he says, "Tins, mostly peas." Now, I feel that in that peas, it's mostly he's playing with the idea of realism. He's exaggerating it to make the stage set funny, in a way that, of course, it wouldn't have been done in the period of the revival.
Of course, yeah. Anybody from the floor? I can't see any questions coming in here. Please, students of theater, professors. another thing that I was thinking about, I've always also taught this, that nationalism, the so-called cultural nationalism and political nationalism didn't always go hand in hand. And there were lots of reactions to the plays by a more, say, more strictly politically informed audience back then. Would you say that, in a way, I think the cultural nationalism of the revival survived better?
Oh, that's a hard one. Patrick Pearse, who I've said was the leader, one of the main leaders of the 1916, after he'd seen Playboy in 1907, he said that for Anglo-Irish drama, it's the beginning of the end. So there was, a very clear divide between the two. But of course, in the short term, you could say the nationalist position won.
Mm-hmm.
After the Free State was established in 1922, then in 1925, the Abbey starts getting a government subsidy. And the government was a fairly small c conservative, very highly Catholic operation, and starts to control basically what the Abbey can put on. And that continues on into the 1960s. Tom Murphy's first play was turned down by the Abbey, not his first play, but Whistle in the Dark, his play of the 1960s, turned down by the Abbey, first performed in London.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, in the kind of short, medium term, the nationalists won out over the kind of Syngean style of drama. That Catholic, that cultural nationalism didn't really survive outside of a very narrow operate. I mean, Beckett leaves Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
O'Casey leaves Ireland. So many of the great playwrights of the period we think of just can't survive as playwrights under that nationalist rule. It changes, of course. But in the short to medium term, clearly the Yeatsian cultural nationalism didn't make it.
Yeah, there were some, of course, attempts, like by Dennis Johnson and Sean O'Casey with expressionism, but also rejected by the Abbey. They say to be successful, you have to be rejected by the Abbey. But anyway, and how does Beckett come into that, say, stage, Irish stage, in terms of these realism, expressionism, and more contemporary?
Well, he doesn't, of course, because his play lacks. His plays become increasingly minimalist. I mean, if you can say become more minimalist than Godot, you're having to really push it. But when you've simply got in Not I, you've just got a mouth speaking. Clearly, the vestiges of realism just aren't there. Just one point I wanted to make, perhaps, about the way in which the Fays at the Abbey, I mentioned that the kind of realism we're talking about, in which you try and reproduce real life on stage through the use of real objects, and André Antoine as the major figure in doing this. The Fays at the Abbey never saw an Antoine production. They only knew of what he was doing through reports. George Moore, of course, had lived in Paris. He had seen Antoine. And when he saw what the Abbey were doing, he said it was nothing like it. But they had an idea of reproducing the reality for the reasons I've given. It fitted into a nationalist ideology of you might be portrayed by the English stage as this kind of person, but we will show you the true Ireland. And the true Ireland is the Ireland of the West, and we will reproduce that West through our detailed stage sets. They are true. And then, of course, Synge blows it by putting on content that they think isn't true.
Yeah. Anybody from the floor? Everybody's shy today. So anyway, Sean, I just wanted to thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon.
It's still raining here.
Is it? Well, I think for Irish and English standards would be fine here today, but kind of cool for us.
Yeah.
But I would encourage anybody who is on the floor to advertise this lecture to colleagues and students. It will stay on PPG's YouTube channel, and because it's a not to be missed lecture, in my opinion, in terms of relating a moment of Irish theatre and a way of staging a reality. And of course, embedded by, oh, there is one question here, I'm sorry. It's from our colleague, Aline Fernandes. Many women playwrights of the time, Kate O'Brien, Margaret O'Leary, for instance, never made it to the Abbey. O'Brien emigrated to England and had her play staged there. Do you see the Abbey as still the guardian of conservative values?
No, not now. I mean, I think even in its, its staging has become far more imaginative now. But it took a long time. I mean, the reasons behind the establishment of the Gate in 1928, and, you know, Dennis Johnson, as you mentioned, an engagement with European styles of theatre was simply something that the Abbey did not want to do. It became a national theatre. It was funded by the national government. There were certain objectives and assumptions around that. And so the staging never really became expressionist. Some of the designs did. I mean, you held up the cover of the book that I did with Chris Morash a few years back, and the woman there is a designer, a set designer for the Abbey, looking down at one of her set designs, which is hardly truly realist. You know, there's an expressionist angling in that. So there are moments in the Abbey when you do have a kind of breakout of that conservatism, but very, very rarely. But is it so conservative now? No, it's not.
I agree, yeah. There was a major change a couple of years ago, but it's been changing, and I wouldn't see it as conservative at all at the moment. With carry on with Aline's question, with many women playwrights being staged. Rosalind Madonna herself belongs to a ethnic minority, has been staged at main stage at the Abbey Theatre, and I think things have really changed. But and I mostly dedicate my time to contemporary theatre, but I'm fascinated by the revival. So I would say the revival plays and playwrights and everything still lives. Please, John. Yeah, we are about to begin. Oh no, there is another question here. I'm sorry. First, the students are thanking you for the great lecture, and a question from Talita, I think, or Tali. I found it fascinating. Could you share your observations on any unique characteristics of specificities in Lady Gregory's use of stage directions in her plays? Good to come to Lady Gregory. I was about to.
Okay. I mean, Lady Gregory's, her Kiltartan plays, she is firmly in that world of the peasant play. Her stage directions, again, the stage, if it's going to be a realist set, then the stage directions have to be detailed and frequently lengthy. I don't have a text of Lady Gregory to hand to be able to read any, but it can become a kind of shorthand. Once the set designers at the Abbey knew what the set was, you don't have to say an awful lot. A peasant cottage. And the fact is, because, as I said, the groups that went to make up finally the Abbey Theatre, they were poor. They couldn't afford huge sets. They were amateur. They didn't really know how to construct elaborate sets. They were nomadic. They couldn't have elaborate sets and keep carting them around different halls in Dublin. So they would use the same sets frequently. So in that sense, they're not having to give very detailed set directions because they can only use a limited number of sets, those they've got in stock. Does that make sense as a response? In other words, the set directions are not going to be highly individual.
Right.
Because they're typical, because they're going to use the sets they've already got for the cottage. If you were to look, for example, at the set directions of Sean O'Casey and compare those to Lady Gregory, you'd see how elaborate O'Casey's are. Because he's not using what had become their stock set that they simply had in the store.
Right. She rephrased her question, but she noted the importance of stage direction in spreading the news and wonder if there are other notable examples. But I think you've already covered.
Yeah, I said if I had Lady Gregory's on the shelves upstairs, I'm afraid.
Oh, well, I have it here, but we'll leave it for. But we're just about, yes, please.
I'm fairly certain that if you looked at the stage directions of Lady Gregory, looked at, for example, the one I read from Synge, Shadow of the Glen, you're not going to see huge differences for the reasons I've given. They're limited in what sets they can use because they were poor, because they were amateur.
And nomadic. Isn't this interesting? That in a way we come to contemporary street theater because they are nomadic. They have to make it work.
I think that's true. Yeah, I think that's true.
That's so interesting. Yeah,
but in terms of your thematic focus on space and psychogeographies, of course, these sets are saying we are the true space of Ireland.
Yeah. What
we are showing you in Dublin is the reality of an island that belongs to you out in the West. The dispute, as I opened with, the basis of the dispute between Gabriel and Miss Ivers. He's not going to his own land. He's going to Europe. And that, both in the quotation I read from Arthur Griffith and in others, to accuse Synge of being European was the worst insult that critics could bring up, really. He was European. These stories, they were from Greek legend. They were nothing to do with Ireland. Ireland was this pure Western place, and we'll show you that real space.
Through revolution. But anyway, I was thinking that isn't it interesting that this true Ireland was of the west of Ireland was represented in Dublin. So there is another issue in terms of space and representation of space. And it was much later that Irish theatre faced the regionalization and the decentralization in terms of theatre representation with the Druid, for instance, that you mentioned. Yeah.
I mean, it is much. There are other theatres, theatre buildings, but the Abbey tended to tour. They would tour to Cork. And of course, they toured to the UK as well. They came over very early in sort of 1905, 1906. They're touring over here, traveling over on a Friday, doing some performances on a Saturday and Sunday, and traveling back overnight by ferry, of course.
Wow.
to be back at work because they were amateurs. So again, that kind of spatial dimension, bringing the west of Ireland to London or to Leeds or to Liverpool or to Cardiff, various places that they performed on their tours, largely to Irish audiences, of course.
Yeah. One of the courses that when I'm teaching one course, I'm always thinking of the next one. One of the courses I would like to teach is the Aran Islands in the Irish imagination. Because once you go there, I think it's never the same, for me at least, in literature. Once you see the real thing, it works differently than when you only grasp the Aran Islands from the Irish imagination in prose and theatre.
Well, the one occasion about 12 years ago, I went to Inishmore and went into a pub, and the TV was on and they were showing English football. I thought, well, Synge would be turning in his grave. Anglicization has totally arrived.
Definitely. So, Sean, I think we will close at this moment. And thank you very much again for being with us, and hope to see you in person before too long.
Make it sunny. Make it sunny.
I will.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye,
Bye-bye, Beatrice. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.